Have you ever felt like your life was a series of misfortunes, one setback after another, a downward spiral with no end in sight? Have you ever been betrayed by those you should have been able to trust the most? Today, we delve into a story that begins in the darkest of pits, a tale of a young man whose dreams were shattered, whose freedom was stolen, and whose life was sold for a handful of silver. It is a saga of jealousy, heartbreak, and injustice that will resonate with the deepest parts of the human experience. But I promise you, if you stay with us until the very end, you will witness one of the most astonishing reversals of fortune ever recorded. A conclusion so profound it reveals a hidden blueprint for hope in the midst of our own trials. This isn't just a story from the ancient past. It's a timeless epic about how the most devastating moments of our lives can become the very foundation for our greatest purpose. Before we journey back in time, I want you to be a part of our global community. Look at the clock, look out your window, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is always a profound inspiration to see how these stories unite us across every time zone and continent. Now take a deep breath and let's travel to the heart of ancient Canaan. In the sun-scorched heartland of Canaan, where the vast azure skies seem to bow down and kiss the rugged earth, and where the echoes of a divine promise lingered in the air of every valley, there lived a family whose destiny would irrevocably shape the course of history for an entire people. This is the story of Joseph, a young man whose journey is a breathtaking tapestry woven with threads of prophetic dreams, bitter betrayal, crushing suffering, and a faith that refused to be extinguished. As the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, and the great-grandson of the patriarch Abraham, Joseph was born into a lineage chosen by God, a bloodline that carried the sacred promise of the Almighty. His extraordinary life serves as a powerful testament to the mysterious and sovereign ways of God, demonstrating how the Creator works, even in the deepest shadows, masterfully transforming the most desperate situations into opportunities for the unfolding of His grand design. Let us together explore the incredible odyssey of this man, who began as a cherished son, was brutally cast down and sold into slavery, and ultimately rose to become one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. This is the chronicle of Joseph, an ordinary man in the hands of an extraordinary God. Joseph entered the world as the 11th son of Jacob, born from the patriarch's profound and enduring love for Rachel, the woman for whom he had labored a staggering 14 years. In the book of Genesis, chapter 30, verses 22 through 24, we witness the sacred moment of his arrival. The scripture reads, "Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, 'God has taken away my disgrace.' She named him Joseph and said, 'May the Lord add to me another son.'" Joseph was far more than just another child in Jacob's sprawling and complex family. He occupied a sacred, protected space within his father's heart. Genesis 37:3 tells us, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe of many colors for him." This was no ordinary garment. It was a tangible, vibrant symbol of the unique and unparalleled love Jacob felt for Joseph. This special bond between father and son had deep and intricate roots. Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel, the wife whom Jacob truly and passionately loved. For many agonizing years, Rachel had remained barren while her sister, Leah, bore son after son for Jacob. Thus, when Joseph was finally born, he was the living, breathing answer to countless prayers, the sweet fruit of a genuine and deep-seated love. For Joseph, his father was a towering figure of faith and character. For Jacob, Joseph was a radiant beam of light in the twilight of his years. The coat that Jacob bestowed upon Joseph was unlike any other. It was a long-sleeved, richly colored tunic fit for a prince, a garment that designated him as set apart, exempt from the grueling manual labor in the fields that his older brothers were forced to endure. Every time Joseph wore it, it served as a stark and public reminder of his favored status. This coat would soon become a potent symbol in his life's narrative, first of profound love, and then of deep, heart-wrenching pain. But what Jacob intended as a tender gesture of affection, his other sons perceived as a glaring emblem of injustice. Jacob's undisguised favoritism planted seeds of a bitter and growing tension within the family. Genesis 37:4 reveals the raw reaction of Joseph's brothers. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Jealousy began to snake its way through their hearts like a noxious weed, choking out any brotherly affection they might have once felt for him. Each loving act from Jacob toward Joseph only served to carve the canyon of their resentment deeper. They ceased to see Joseph as their brother and instead viewed him as a threat, a rival who had stolen their father's affection. That vibrant, multi-hued coat became a constant, infuriating reminder of the perceived injustice they suffered. While they toiled relentlessly under the hot sun, Joseph moved about with an air of freedom, clad in his robe of privilege, the son who did not have to bear the same burdens. The simmering family tensions were about to boil over when Joseph, a mere 17 years old, began to have a series of strange and vivid dreams that seemed to point toward a future where he would hold authority over his entire family. Not fully grasping the profound implications of these dreams or the explosive consequences of sharing them, Joseph naively recounted them to his brothers. The first dream came to him as a clear and powerful vision in the night. In Genesis 37:5-7, Joseph narrates, "Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.'" This was no mere flight of a teenage boy's imagination. It was a divine message, a prophecy of the future God had ordained for Joseph. The sheaves represented Jacob's family, and Joseph's sheaf rising to prominence symbolized the authority he would one day wield over them. The reaction from his brothers was immediate and venomous. Genesis 37:8 records their indignant response. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. It wasn't long before Joseph had a second dream, this one even more grandiose and startling. In Genesis 37:9 we read, "Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. 'Listen,' he said, 'I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.'" This dream took the implications even further. It was not just his 11 brothers, the stars, who would bow, but also his father and mother, symbolized by the sun and moon, a breathtakingly audacious prophecy for any young man to share, especially one already weathering the storm of his brother's envy. When Joseph recounted this dream to his father as well as his brothers, even Jacob was taken aback by its staggering implications. Genesis 37:10-11 tells us, "When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, 'What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?' His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Jacob's rebuke was not just about the content of the dream. It was also about Joseph's seeming lack of prudence. It was as if Jacob was saying, "Do you truly believe that I, the patriarch of this family, will bow before you, my own son?" Yet despite this public correction, Jacob privately pondered the dream's meaning in his heart. He knew that God often spoke through dreams, and he sensed that perhaps something far deeper was at play. For Joseph's brothers, however, these dreams were the final straw. Their father's favoritism was already a bitter pill to swallow, but the thought that they might one day bow down to Joseph was utterly unbearable. Their jealousy metastasized into a burning hatred, a volatile fire just waiting for the right moment to erupt into a devastating inferno. Sometime later, Joseph's brothers had journeyed to Shechem, a significant distance of about 50 miles from their home in Hebron, where they were grazing their father's flocks. During their absence, Jacob decided to send Joseph to check on their welfare. In Genesis 37:13-14, we see the moment Jacob dispatches Joseph on this fateful mission. Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Joseph did not question his father's command. Despite knowing the depth of his brother's hatred for him, he obeyed without a moment's hesitation. This obedience was a defining characteristic of Joseph's life, one that would remain with him throughout his arduous journey. He set out from Hebron, wearing his coat of many colors, completely unaware that this would be the last time he would see his father for many long, agonizing years. When Joseph arrived in Shechem, he began searching for his brothers, but he couldn't find them in the pastures where he expected them to be. As he wandered through the area, searching for any sign of them, a seemingly random encounter occurred that would alter the course of his life forever. Genesis 37:15-17 tells us, "A man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, 'What are you looking for?' He replied, 'I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?' 'They have moved on from here,' the man answered. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" This meeting was no accident. God was orchestrating Joseph's every step, even in that seemingly insignificant moment. The man didn't just see Joseph wandering, he asked the right question and happened to know exactly where the brothers had gone. It was divine intervention disguised as mere coincidence. Armed with this new information, Joseph set out for Dothan, determined to complete the mission his father had given him. We can only speculate about Joseph's thoughts during this additional leg of his journey. Perhaps he was eager to see his brothers, or maybe he felt a sense of unease about what lay ahead. Whatever his feelings, he pressed onward, faithful to the task his father had set before him. As Joseph neared Dothan, he saw his brothers in the distance. What he did not know was that they had already seen him. Genesis 37:18 reveals their chilling reaction. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. The solitary figure walking toward them, dressed in that unmistakable coat of many colors, was instantly recognizable, and that moment of recognition reignited all the bitter resentment that had been festering in their hearts. As Joseph approached, perhaps waving or calling out to them, oblivious to the mortal danger he was in, the brothers huddled together, their minds dark with conspiracy. The distance between them was more than just geographical. It symbolized the deep emotional chasm that favoritism and jealousy had carved through their family. As they watched him draw closer, the hatred they had nurtured for so long finally found its outlet. Far from the protective gaze of their father, they could finally act on their seething resentment. Genesis 37:19-20 gives us a chilling glimpse into their dark thoughts. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Hatred had blinded Joseph's brothers. They no longer saw him as flesh and blood, as their younger brother, but only as that dreamer, the object of their scorn. The plan was brutal and simple. Murder Joseph, dispose of his body in a dry cistern, and concoct a lie to cover their tracks. In their twisted minds, that would be the end of his grand dreams. However, not all the brothers were in agreement. Reuben, the eldest, stepped in. As the firstborn, he felt a greater weight of responsibility and knew he would be held accountable by their father. Genesis 37:21-22 records his intervention. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Reuben's plan was more humane, but it was still deeply flawed. He intended to secretly return later and rescue Joseph, bringing him home safely, but he lacked the courage to openly defy his brothers, opting instead for a half measure, a compromise that would ultimately fail to produce the outcome he hoped for. Unaware of this dark plotting, Joseph finally reached his brothers. The encounter was swift and violent. Genesis 37:23-24 describes the scene. "So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it." We can only imagine the shock and terror that must have flooded Joseph's being in that moment. Seconds before, he was on a mission, filled with purpose. And then suddenly he was seized. His coat, the very symbol of his father's love, was ripped from him, and he was hurled into a dry pit. A cistern, a rock-hewn pit used to collect rainwater, would have been dry at that time of year. It was deep and dark, and there was no way for Joseph to climb out without help. The boy who had dreamed of greatness now found himself at the bottom of a hole, looking up at the faces of his brothers, faces filled not with love, but with pure hatred. From within that pit, Joseph must have cried out, begging for mercy. Years later, his brothers would remember this moment with deep regret. In Genesis 42:21, they would say to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen." Joseph's cries fell on deaf ears. All of them, with the possible exception of Reuben, had hardened their hearts. While Joseph was trapped at the bottom of the cistern, his brothers sat down to eat a meal as if nothing had happened. It was the ultimate display of coldness and a complete lack of compassion. But as they were eating, something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of history forever. Genesis 37:25 tells us, "As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt." It was a group of merchants traveling along the ancient trade route that connected Mesopotamia with Egypt, passing through the land of Canaan. Seeing the caravan, Judah, another of the brothers, had an idea that he presented as more humane, but which in reality both rid them of Joseph and satisfied their own greed. Genesis 37:26-27 records his words. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Judah's proposal had two key appeals in the eyes of the brothers. It avoided the direct act of murder, which perhaps salved their consciences to some degree, and it also offered a financial profit. Furthermore, by selling Joseph to merchants on their way to Egypt, they ensured he would be far enough away to never return and reveal the truth to Jacob. Wasting no time, they put their new plan into action. Genesis 37:28 describes the moment. "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." The text's mention of both Ishmaelites and Midianites likely indicates it was a mixed merchant caravan, different groups, but all descendants of Abraham through sons other than Isaac. The price for which Joseph was sold, 20 shekels of silver, was the average price for a young slave at that time. To his brothers, Joseph was worth no more than that. The young man who had dreamed of greatness was now a mere commodity, sold like livestock, torn from his land and his family. Reuben, who had been secretly planning to rescue Joseph, was not present when his brothers sold him. Genesis 37:29-30 reveals his reaction upon his return. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Reuben was genuinely distraught, not only for Joseph, but because, as the eldest, he felt responsible before their father. Meanwhile, the merchant caravan continued its journey toward Egypt, carrying Joseph as just another piece of their cargo. For Joseph, it was the beginning of a journey into a foreign land where he knew nothing of the language, the customs, or the religion. Everything he had known and loved was left behind. His father, Jacob, his homeland, his freedom. His future looked bleak and utterly hopeless. But God had not abandoned him. In fact, through this terrible injustice, God was beginning to set in motion the fulfillment of the very prophetic dreams he had given to Joseph. As Joseph was being carried toward Egypt, his brothers now had to deal with the second part of their plan: what to tell Jacob about the disappearance of his beloved son. They decided to concoct an elaborate lie to deceive their father. Genesis 37:31-32 tells us how they executed their deception. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." The coat of many colors, once the tangible symbol of Jacob's love for Joseph, now became the centerpiece of a cruel deception. The brothers chose not to state outright that Joseph was dead. Instead, they presented the evidence and let Jacob draw his own conclusion, a lie made all the more sophisticated by its subtlety. When they stood before their father, they didn't have to say much. They just had to present the blood-soaked robe and feign uncertainty about whether it was Joseph's. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to make their father believe the worst without them having to speak the lie themselves. Jacob's reaction was exactly what the brothers had anticipated. Genesis 37-33 shows his immediate response. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob's conclusion was precisely the one they wanted him to reach. His grief was immense and all-consuming. Genesis 37:34-35 describes the depth of his sorrow. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. The biblical text shows us a man in absolute agony. The tearing of his clothes and the wearing of sackcloth were the outward signs of deep mourning in that culture. But Jacob's grief went far beyond common custom. It was an inconsolable sorrow, a pain he declared would end only with his own death. The cruel irony is that all his children came to comfort him, including the very sons who had sold Joseph and orchestrated the entire lie. They feigned shared grief with their father while hiding the terrible truth. Joseph was not dead. He was on his way to Egypt as a slave. Jacob's declaration that he would mourn until he went down to the grave with his son expressed his intention to live in sorrow for the rest of his life. The loss of Joseph, the son he loved most, the son of his beloved Rachel, was a wound he believed would never heal. Little could he imagine that many years later he would receive the staggering news that Joseph was not only alive but held a position of immense power in the land of Egypt. While Jacob descended into his inconsolable grief, Joseph's brothers carried on with their lives, bearing the heavy burden of their terrible secret. They had gotten rid of the brother they envied, but the cost would be high. Years of guilt and of watching their father suffer endlessly. While Jacob mourned, believing his son to be dead, Joseph was arriving in Egypt as a slave. His life had been turned completely upside down in a matter of days. From favored son to foreign servant, the fall seemed irreversible. But even in these dire circumstances, Joseph was not alone. Genesis 39:1 tells us what happened when Joseph reached Egypt. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Potiphar was no ordinary man. He was a high-ranking officer, the captain of the guard under Pharaoh himself. This meant that Joseph found himself in the household of someone with significant standing in Egyptian society. In this new and foreign world, something extraordinary began to happen. Genesis 39:2-3 reveals, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did." This is one of the most powerful refrains in Joseph's story. At a time when all seemed lost, when he was far from home and sold into bondage, the text emphasizes that the Lord was with Joseph. God had not abandoned the young man. Even in the harshest of conditions, God's presence in Joseph's life was not just a spiritual comfort, it manifested in tangible ways. Joseph prospered in everything he did, so much so that his Egyptian master, a man who worshipped other gods, noticed there was something special about this young Hebrew slave. Joseph's success was so remarkable that he quickly earned Potiphar's trust. Genesis 39:4 tells us, "Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned." For a newly arrived foreign slave to be put in charge of an entire estate was nothing short of miraculous. Joseph's rise within Potiphar's house continued. Genesis 39:5-6 describes, "From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph." The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Joseph's positive influence was so powerful that it brought blessings upon Potiphar's entire household. Crops flourished, business dealings prospered, and the household ran smoothly, all because of Joseph's presence and, by extension, God's presence through him. Potiphar recognized Joseph's value and gave him complete authority. The only thing he concerned himself with was the food he ate, an expression that might allude to his personal affairs, including his wife, which would soon become tragically relevant. The text adds one more detail about Joseph. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. This seemingly minor note becomes critically important later in the story, as Joseph's good looks would soon attract unwanted attention from Potiphar's wife. Joseph's life in Potiphar's house seemed to have finally reached a point of stability. Even as a slave, he held a position of great responsibility and trust. But his appearance and his role in the household would soon lead to a new crisis. Genesis 39:7 marks the beginning of that trouble. "And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, 'Come to bed with me.'" Potiphar's wife didn't just admire Joseph from afar. She was bold and direct in her intentions, inviting him into an adulterous affair. Joseph was now faced with a very real and dangerous temptation. He was young, far from home, immersed in a culture with different moral values, and the woman tempting him was powerful, the wife of his master. Many in Joseph's position might have succumbed, but he demonstrated incredible strength of character. Genesis 39:8-9 shows Joseph's firm response, but he refused. "With me in charge," he told his master's wife, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph's words reveal so much about his integrity. First, he acknowledged his loyalty to Potiphar, recognizing the trust the man had placed in him. But more importantly, he identified the act as a sin against God. Even in Egypt, far from his family and his community of faith, Joseph held fast to his beliefs and moral values. However, Potiphar's wife was not easily deterred. Genesis 39:10 tells us, "And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her." This was not a one-time temptation. It was a persistent daily harassment. Yet Joseph remained steadfast in his resolve. The situation came to a head one day when Joseph found himself alone in the house with Potiphar's wife. Genesis 39:11-12 describes the confrontation. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Potiphar's wife escalated her pursuit, grabbing Joseph's cloak and trying to physically force him. Joseph's response was clear and immediate. He fled, leaving his cloak behind. It was a powerful demonstration that, for Joseph, integrity before God was more important than comfort or even personal safety. However, his escape turned her desire into rage. Rejected and humiliated, she decided to seek revenge. Genesis chapter 39:13-15 recounts what happened next. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar's wife completely twisted the story. She presented herself as the victim when, in fact, she was the aggressor. She used Joseph's cloak, which should have been evidence of his innocence, as false evidence against him. Strategically, she also appealed to ethnic prejudice by pointing out that Joseph was a Hebrew, a foreigner, and she didn't stop there. Genesis 39:16-18 continues, "She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. 'That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.'" The accusation was carefully crafted to provoke Potiphar's rage. She not only accused Joseph of trying to assault her, but also subtly blamed Potiphar himself for bringing Joseph into their home. The lie was delivered so convincingly that Potiphar believed his wife without question. Potiphar's reaction was swift and severe. Genesis 39:19-20 records, "When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." For Potiphar, the evidence seemed conclusive. Joseph's cloak was in his wife's possession, and she had told a consistent story. Even if he had some private doubts, as a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court, he had to act to protect his reputation and honor. Joseph, the young man who had survived being sold into slavery and had built a new life in Potiphar's household, now faced another catastrophic downfall. From a respected and trusted administrator, he was cast down to become a prisoner, condemned for a crime he did not commit. Once again, he was the victim of human injustice. The prison Joseph was sent to was not an ordinary jail. It was the place where the king's prisoners were held, likely a high-security facility reserved for political criminals or those who had crossed the court. For Joseph, this was yet another rock-bottom moment in his life. However, even in this dark chapter, the biblical text offers a glimmer of hope. Genesis 39:21 tells us, "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." Even in prison, God's presence remained with Joseph. Just as Potiphar had once recognized something special in him, the warden would soon do the same. Just as his colorful coat had ignited envy in his brothers, and his handsome features had ignited lust in Potiphar's wife, now Joseph's character would shine even in the darkness of an Egyptian prison. God's plan for his life was still unfolding, even in the midst of injustice and suffering. Pharaoh's prison was no ordinary place. It was a grim fortress where disgraced members of the royal court were held. There, separated from everything he knew, Joseph entered a new phase of his life, falsely accused of a crime he did not commit. The cold, damp walls of an Egyptian dungeon would have been enough to break the spirit of any man, but there was something different about Joseph. As we read in Genesis 39:21, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Even in the dungeon, God had not abandoned Joseph. The warden, who was responsible for all the prisoners, soon recognized that there was something exceptional about this young Hebrew man. We don't know exactly how Joseph conducted himself in those early days behind bars, but it is easy to imagine he displayed the same integrity and diligence he had in Potiphar's house. His attitude must have stood out. Genesis 39:22 tells us, "So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there." This was a remarkable promotion. From a mere prisoner, Joseph became the warden's right-hand man, overseeing all the others. The warden's trust in Joseph was so complete that according to Genesis 39:23, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. This scene mirrors what had happened before in Potiphar's house. Joseph's integrity and administrative skills once again set him apart. It's astonishing how the biblical text repeatedly emphasizes this one crucial truth: the Lord was with Joseph. It is as if the author is reminding us that despite the terrible circumstances, Joseph was not alone. God's presence continued to follow and bless him even in a place as unlikely as an Egyptian prison. While other prisoners might have languished in despair, Joseph was actively serving, managing the prison with excellence. He had turned a punishment into an opportunity. Instead of succumbing to despair, Joseph continued to trust God and use his abilities to the fullest, even in adversity. Sometime after Joseph was put in charge of the prison, two new and high-profile prisoners arrived. They were not ordinary men. They were high-ranking officials from Pharaoh's own court. Genesis 40:1-3 tells us, "Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined." The text does not specify what crime these two officials committed, only that they had offended Pharaoh. In the ancient world, even a minor mistake in preparing the royal wine or bread could be seen as a grave offense, perhaps even a potential assassination attempt. Whatever their error, it was serious enough to enrage Pharaoh and land them in prison. As important men, these two officials were placed under Joseph's care. Genesis 44 says, "The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them." Joseph didn't just manage the prison, he personally looked after the needs of these special prisoners. One night, something unusual happened. Genesis 45:7 tells us, "Each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, 'Why do your faces look so sad today?' Joseph showed remarkable sensitivity, noticing that something was wrong with the two men. He could have easily ignored their mood and focused on his duties, but instead, he paid attention to their troubled faces and asked what was wrong. It was a small act of kindness that revealed Joseph's caring character. The two men replied in Genesis 48, "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Joseph's response is particularly interesting. In a land full of diviners and dream interpreters, Joseph made no claim to be an expert himself. Instead, he gave all the credit to God, declaring that only God could truly interpret dreams. It was a bold statement for a Hebrew prisoner in the heart of pagan Egypt. The chief cupbearer went first. In Genesis 40, 9-11, he said, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." It was a dream rich with symbolism. The vine, the 3 branches, the grapes being pressed into Pharaoh's cup. The cupbearer may have feared the worst, but Joseph delivered a hopeful interpretation. In Genesis 40, 12-13, Joseph explained, "This is what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." Joseph's interpretation was straightforward. In just 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. This was wonderful news. But Joseph didn't stop there. Seizing the opportunity, he added a personal request. In Genesis 40, 14-15, we see Joseph's plea. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." This is a profoundly human moment in Joseph's story. Despite all his faith and trust in God, Joseph was still a man suffering under injustice. He saw the cupbearer as a potential way out. Perhaps his situation could finally change. All Joseph asked was to be remembered, and for the cupbearer to speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. Seeing the favorable interpretation given to the cupbearer, the chief baker mustered the courage to share his own dream. In Genesis 40, 16-17, he said, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." This dream also featured the number 3 and a reference to his profession. But there was a dark element, the birds eating from the basket on his head. Sadly, Joseph's interpretation was not encouraging. In Genesis 40, 18-19, Joseph replied, "This is what it means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." This second dream had a tragic interpretation. Within 3 days, the baker would be executed by Pharaoh. The birds eating from the basket symbolized the birds that would eat his flesh after his death. Unlike the cupbearer, he would not be restored, but would meet a grim end. Joseph's courage in delivering this difficult message is also remarkable. He could have softened the blow or made something up, but he chose to speak the truth, even when it was hard to say and even harder to hear. Just as Joseph had predicted, something significant happened in Pharaoh's court 3 days later. It was a day of celebration, a major occasion in the kingdom. Genesis 40:20 tells us, "Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials." Pharaoh's birthday was the perfect time for momentous decisions. In the midst of the celebration, surrounded by his officials, Pharaoh rendered his judgment on the 2 imprisoned officials. It was customary for kings to grant pardons or issue sentences on such festive occasions, and this day was no exception. The story continues in Genesis 40, 21-22. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. Joseph's interpretations had come true to the letter. The cupbearer was back in his old role, once again placing the cup in Pharaoh's hand. In contrast, the baker was impaled on a pole exactly as Joseph had foreseen. This precise fulfillment of the dreams proved that Joseph truly had a divine gift. He wasn't just making educated guesses or reading people's emotions. God was genuinely revealing the meaning of the dreams to him. For the cupbearer, the day brought joy and restoration. He returned to the palace, resumed his duties, and probably thanked the Egyptian gods for his good fortune. For the baker, the day brought the tragedy Joseph had foretold. But what about Joseph? Did the now restored cupbearer remember to mention the young Hebrew man to Pharaoh? Were the prison doors finally about to open for Joseph? Tragically, it was not to be. Genesis 40:23 tells us, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." That verse is heartbreaking to read. After all the help Joseph had given the cupbearer in interpreting his dream and giving him hope in the dark days of his imprisonment, the man simply forgot about Joseph once he was back in the comfort of the court. Perhaps in the joy of his restoration, the cupbearer got swept up in the ceremonies and luxury of the palace. Or perhaps he deliberately avoided mentioning that he had received help from a Hebrew prisoner. The biblical text does not say exactly how much time passed, but in Genesis 41 we learn that 2 full years later, Pharaoh had a dream. That means Joseph was left forgotten in prison for 2 long years after the events with the cupbearer and the baker. 2 years of waiting, 2 years of apparent abandonment. By this time, Joseph was around 30 years old. He had spent his entire young adulthood away from home, first living as a slave, then as a prisoner. For many, such a long period of waiting and suffering would have crushed any remaining hope. But God was not finished with his work in Joseph's life. In fact, the most extraordinary events were still to come. 2 full years had passed and Joseph remained in prison until something extraordinary happened in the royal palace. Pharaoh himself, the supreme ruler of Egypt, worshipped by his people as a living god, began to have terrifying dreams that no one could interpret. Genesis 41:1-4 describes the first dream. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. This was no ordinary dream. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt, and cows were symbols of prosperity and fertility. But in the dream, something unnatural happened. The gaunt, sickly cows devoured the healthy, beautiful ones. It was a disturbing image that suggested something was deeply wrong with the natural order. Pharaoh fell asleep again, but his rest was once more interrupted by another bizarre dream. Genesis 41:5-7 recounts, "He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream." Once again, the dream involved key symbols of Egyptian life. This time, grain, the foundation of their diet. And once again, there was a disturbing pattern. That which was withered and worthless consumed that which was abundant and valuable. These dreams left Pharaoh deeply troubled. Genesis 41:8 tells us, "In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him." Egypt was famous for its magicians, priests, and dream interpreters. Pharaoh had access to the most learned and experienced minds in the land. They consulted ancient texts, appealed to the Egyptian gods, and used all their skills to decipher the royal dreams. But this time, no one could provide an interpretation that satisfied the pharaoh. His agitation must have grown with each failure. In ancient Egypt, dreams, especially when they were vivid, symbolic, and recurring, were considered divine messages. The inability of the wisest men to interpret them hinted at something extraordinary, something beyond conventional Egyptian wisdom. While the entire palace was in turmoil, desperately searching for an answer, Joseph remained forgotten in prison. But God had not forgotten him, and his moment of deliverance was finally at hand. Pharaoh's two dreams, with their very similar messages, expressed through different imagery, served a distinct purpose. They were not just the product of a restless royal mind or the result of a heavy meal. They were divine messages intended not for the magicians of Egypt with all their fallible wisdom, but for a young Hebrew man who believed in the one true God. Joseph's time in prison was about to come to an end, and Pharaoh's troubling dreams would be the key to his release. God had been preparing Joseph through years of hardship for this very moment, when he would be called upon to interpret what no wise man in Egypt could understand. As all of Egypt's wise men failed to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, an atmosphere of anxiety and tension descended upon the palace. It was at this critical moment that the chief cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Genesis 41:9-13 records the moment he spoke up. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Finally, after 2 long years, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Notice how he presented Joseph to Pharaoh, not just as a prisoner, but as someone with an extraordinary gift, someone who had accurately interpreted their dreams in the past. Pharaoh's reaction was immediate. Genesis chapter 41:14 tells us, "So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from Tamam, the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh." The change in Joseph's life was dramatic and sudden. One moment he was a forgotten prisoner, and the next he was being summoned before the most powerful man in Egypt. The text's mention of Joseph shaving and changing his clothes shows that he understood the gravity of the moment. In Egyptian culture, a clean-shaven appearance was highly valued, especially for someone appearing before the pharaoh. Imagine the scene. Joseph, the young Hebrew man who had been sold into slavery and unjustly imprisoned, now walking through the corridors of the royal palace, escorted by guards to the throne room where Pharaoh awaited him. His heart must have been pounding, but his trust was in the God who had sustained him through all those difficult years. When he finally stood before Pharaoh, there was no ceremony or elaborate introduction. The ruler was eager to have his dreams interpreted. Genesis 41:15 says, "Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.'" It was a direct statement, almost a challenge. Pharaoh wasn't asking for a favor, he was stating his expectation. After all, he was the absolute ruler of Egypt, accustomed to being obeyed without question. Joseph's reply, however, showed incredible humility. In Genesis 41:16, he said, "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This response reveals Joseph's true character. Standing before the most powerful man in the known world, he did not try to impress or take credit for himself. Instead, he pointed to God. It was a bold declaration in Egypt, a land of many gods where Pharaoh himself was considered divine. Joseph was stating without hesitation that the God of the Hebrews, not the Egyptian gods, not the magicians, not even Joseph himself, would provide the interpretation. It was a display of faith and humility that must have surprised Pharaoh, who was used to his advisors constantly trying to win his favor. Unfazed by the majesty of the Egyptian throne or the gravity of the moment, Joseph remained true to his integrity and his faith. He knew that any gift or skill he possessed came from God, and he did not hesitate to give credit where it was due. Pharaoh, perhaps intrigued by this unexpected response or simply desperate for an interpretation, proceeded to share the details of his dreams. Now Joseph would have to trust that the same God who had given him interpretations in prison would help him once again, this time in the court of Egypt. After listening intently to both of Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph did not hesitate in his interpretation. He spoke with a clarity and confidence that could only have come from God. Genesis 41:25-28 records the beginning of his explanation. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph explained that the 2 dreams were actually a single message, repeated to emphasize its certainty and importance. The cows and the grain represented years, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. The repetition of the dream in 2 different forms was a sign of divine resolve. Continuing in Genesis 41:29-31, Joseph elaborated, "7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe." Joseph didn't just interpret the dreams, he made the gravity of the situation clear. The coming famine would be so devastating that it would completely overshadow the years of plenty. It would be an unprecedented crisis capable of destroying the land. Then in Genesis 41:32, Joseph added, "The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." This final part of the interpretation was a stark warning. This was not a distant possibility, but a divine plan already in motion. The repetition of the dream was a sign of urgency and certainty. Most interpreters might have stopped there, content with having solved the mystery, but Joseph went further. He offered practical advice. In Genesis 41:33-36, he said, "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." Joseph didn't just predict the problem, he offered a complete solution. His plan was clear and specific. Appoint a wise administrator to oversee the entire land of Egypt. Establish a collection system to gather a portion of the harvest during the good years. Build storage facilities in the cities to reserve the grain, and use this reserve during the famine years to prevent a national catastrophe. It was a brilliant administrative strategy that revealed not only Joseph's deep spiritual insight, but also his skills in leadership and planning. His time managing Potiphar's household and the royal prison had prepared him for this moment of proposing national policy. The initial reaction from Pharaoh and his officials was one of profound admiration. Genesis 41:37-38 tells us, "The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, 'Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?' It is remarkable that Pharaoh himself acknowledged that the Spirit of God was with Joseph. For an Egyptian king who worshipped a pantheon of gods and considered himself divine, this admission of the presence of Joseph's God was extraordinary. There was something in Joseph's wisdom and character that deeply resonated with Pharaoh. Joseph's practical advice, combined with his clear interpretation, had left an undeniable impression. In a single encounter, Joseph had gone from a forgotten prisoner to a respected advisor in the most powerful court in the ancient world. And it all happened because he was willing to give God the credit for his gifts. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh made a stunning decision. Instead of just thanking him for the interpretation and sending him away, Pharaoh saw in Joseph the ideal person to execute the very plan he had proposed. Genesis 41:39-40 records Pharaoh's words. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." This was an unprecedented promotion. In a matter of minutes, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being the second most powerful person in Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself stood above him in the hierarchy. This decision showed not only the deep impression Joseph had made, but also the urgency with which Pharaoh viewed the coming crisis. To formalize this extraordinary appointment, Pharaoh conducted a symbolic ceremony. Genesis 41:41-43 describes it. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Each element of this ceremony was steeped in deep cultural significance in ancient Egypt. The signet ring represented royal authority. The one who wore it could authorize documents in Pharaoh's name. It was like being given the pen to sign the nation's laws. The robes of fine linen were reserved for nobility and priests. They symbolized purity and high status. Joseph, who had worn the clothes of a slave and a prisoner, was now dressed in the finest garments Egypt could offer. The gold chain symbolized honor and public recognition. It was a visible sign of Joseph's favor with Pharaoh. The royal chariot represented power and presence. Joseph now had the authority to travel anywhere in Egypt as Pharaoh's representative. The heralds shouting, "Make way!" announced to all the people that Joseph was no longer a despised foreigner, but an authority to whom everyone must show respect. Pharaoh continued to formalize Joseph's new position. In Genesis 41:44, he declared, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." This was a declaration of absolute authority. Nothing was to happen in Egypt without Joseph's approval. It was a nearly limitless power entrusted to a former slave and prisoner. The transformation in Joseph's life could not have been more complete. To fully integrate Joseph into Egyptian society, Pharaoh did two more important things. First, he gave Joseph an Egyptian name. Genesis 41:45 tells us, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, to be his wife. The name Zaphanath-Paneah likely means God speaks and he lives, or the one who reveals secrets. It acknowledged Joseph's unique ability to interpret dreams. The new name also made it easier for the Egyptians to accept Joseph in such a high position, as a foreign name might have met with resistance. Second, Pharaoh arranged a marriage for Joseph with Asenath, the daughter of a high-ranking priest, and not just any priest, but one from Heliopolis, one of the most important religious centers in Egypt. This marriage linked Joseph to the religious elite of Egypt and gave him even greater social standing. Joseph had arrived in Egypt as a destitute slave, sold by his own brothers. Now, through extraordinary circumstances guided by God, he was practically a pharaoh himself, with a new name, a wife from a noble family, and authority over the entire land. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder of how God can transform even the worst situations into opportunities for his greater plan. Joseph wasted no time in putting his plan into action. There were 7 years of plenty ahead, but the famine would follow, and every moment of preparation was precious. Genesis 41:46-49 tells us how Joseph began his work. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. and Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced bountifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food from the fields around it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. At the age of 30, Joseph was finally seeing the fulfillment of the dreams of his youth. He had gone from the prison to the palace, and now he was traveling throughout Egypt to organize the most ambitious storage system the ancient world had ever seen. The text shows us that Joseph didn't just sit on a throne giving orders. He traveled through Egypt to personally oversee the implementation of his plan. In each city, he established granaries to store the local harvest. It was a brilliant logistical strategy. The grain didn't have to be transported far, and each region would have its own reserve when the famine struck. The abundance of those 7 years was so great that Joseph eventually stopped measuring the amount of grain being stored. It was like the sand of the sea, a biblical expression for something immeasurable. The plan was working beyond all expectations. During this time of prosperity, Joseph's personal life also flourished. Genesis 41:57-52 tells us, "Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, 'It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household.' The second son he named Ephraim and said, 'It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering.'" The names Joseph gave his sons reveal so much about his emotional and spiritual state at this point in his life. Manasseh means one who causes to forget. Joseph was acknowledging that God had helped him overcome the trauma of his betrayal by his brothers and his separation from his father. It's not that Joseph had forgotten his family, that becomes clear later in the story, but the sting of those memories had been soothed by the new purpose God had given him. Ephraim means doubly fruitful. This name celebrated the fact that God had turned Joseph's suffering into prosperity. After years as a slave and a prisoner, Joseph now held a position of honor, had a family, and was living with a meaningful purpose. What his brothers had intended for evil, God had turned into good. Eventually, the 7 years of abundance came to an end, just as Joseph had predicted, and the famine began to grip the land. Genesis 41:53-54 describes the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt, there was food. The famine was not limited to Egypt. It extended to the surrounding regions as well. This was a regional crisis affecting many nations and peoples. However, thanks to Joseph's plan, Egypt was better prepared than any other nation. The people's reaction was swift. Genesis 41:55-56 continues, "When the whole land of Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, 'Go to Joseph and do what he tells you.' When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. The system worked exactly as intended. When the people began to suffer from hunger, Pharaoh didn't have to worry. He simply referred them to Joseph, who had everything under control. Joseph opened the storehouses that had been filled during the years of plenty and began to distribute the grain in an organized manner. It is interesting to note that the text says Joseph sold the grain to the Egyptians. This was not a free handout, but a controlled sale that would have helped prevent panic, hoarding, or waste. It also ensured that the system could be sustained throughout the 7 long years of famine. The crisis was so severe that it reached beyond Egypt's borders. Genesis 41:57 concludes, "And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere." This final verse sets the stage for the next crucial moment in Joseph's story, the reunion with his brothers. The famine that was ravaging the known world eventually reached Canaan, where Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family were living. The crisis that could have destroyed Egypt not only saved the nation, but also became the means for the preservation and reunion of Joseph's own family. Joseph's divinely inspired plan had succeeded perfectly. From a forgotten prisoner, he had become the savior of a nation and, unwittingly, the savior of his own family. His journey from the pit to the palace was nearly complete, but God had even more surprises in store for this faithful servant. The famine that Joseph had foretold did not stop at the borders of Egypt. It spread to the neighboring lands, including Canaan, where Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family lived. As their food supplies dwindled, Jacob heard that there was grain available in Egypt. In Genesis 42, 1-2, we see how the news reached them. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Jacob sent 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy food, but he kept Benjamin, the youngest, at home. Genesis 42:4 explains, "But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him." Benjamin was, besides Joseph, the only other son of Rachel, and after the loss of Joseph, Jacob was intensely protective of Benjamin. When the brothers arrived in Egypt, they were directed to Joseph, just like everyone else who came to buy grain. Genesis 42:6-7 describes the moment. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. This was the pivotal moment in the story. Joseph's dreams from his youth, the dreams that had so enraged his brothers, were now coming true, literally. They were bowing down to him just like the sheaves in his first dream. However, Joseph decided not to reveal his identity immediately. Instead, he accused them of being spies. Genesis 42:9 records, "Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, 'You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected.'" The brothers vehemently denied this, explaining that they were all sons of one man living in Canaan. Joseph maintained his accusation and had them put in prison for 3 days. Then he proposed a test. One of them would remain as a surety, while the others returned to Canaan to fetch Benjamin, the younger brother they had mentioned. This, he said, would prove their honesty and show they were not spies. The distraught brothers spoke among themselves about their predicament, not knowing that Joseph understood every word they said. They spoke in Hebrew, assuming he needed an interpreter. Genesis 42:21-22 records their conversation. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." Hearing this, Joseph was deeply moved. Genesis 42:24 records, "He turned away from them and began to weep." Even after all these years, the pain of the betrayal was still raw, and now, seeing his brother's genuine remorse, Joseph was overcome with emotion. Joseph chose Simeon to remain as a hostage and ordered the other brothers' sacks to be filled with grain. Secretly, he also instructed that the money each of them had brought be returned to their sacks along with their food. The brothers left, leaving Simeon imprisoned in Egypt. When the 9 brothers returned home, they told Jacob everything that had happened, and they were stunned to discover the money in their sacks. Genesis 42:35 records, "As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Jacob was devastated at the thought of having to send Benjamin to Egypt. In Genesis 42:36, he lamented, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Reuben tried to reassure his father by offering his own sons as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety, but Jacob was adamant. "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow." However, the famine continued, and eventually their food ran out. Jacob told his sons to return to Egypt for more supplies, but Judah reminded him that they could not go without Benjamin. Genesis 43:3-5 records Judah's words. "But Judah said to him, 'The man warned us solemnly, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, because the man said to us, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.' Finally, Judah offered himself as a personal guarantee for Benjamin's safety, promising Jacob, 'I myself will be responsible for him. You can hold me personally accountable. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life.'" Moved by this promise, Jacob finally agreed. He instructed his sons to take gifts for the governor of Egypt: balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds, as well as double the amount of money to return what had been found in their sacks. Saddened but resolute, the brothers set out for Egypt, this time with Benjamin. When Joseph saw Benjamin with his brothers, he was deeply moved. He ordered his steward to bring them to his house for a meal. The brothers panicked, thinking they were being arrested as punishment for the silver found in their sacks. At Joseph's house, they explained everything to the steward, who reassured them. "It's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Then he brought Simeon out to them. When Joseph came in for the meal, they presented their gifts and bowed low before him. He asked them how their father was doing, and then saw Benjamin. Genesis 43:29-30 records the emotional moment. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. During the feast, Joseph had the brothers seated in order from oldest to youngest, which astounded them. How could this Egyptian official possibly know their birth order? He then gave Benjamin a portion of food 5 times larger than anyone else's, subtly testing to see if their jealousy remained. The next morning, Joseph had their bags filled with grain once more, and again, their silver was returned to their sacks. But this time, he added something else. His own personal silver cup was placed in Benjamin's sack. Soon after they left, Joseph sent his steward after them to accuse them of theft. Confident in their innocence, the brothers said, "If any of your servants is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my lord's slaves." When the cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack, they tore their clothes in agony. Back at Joseph's house, Judah stepped forward and made a heartfelt appeal, offering himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. In Genesis 44:18-34, Judah explained the entire situation, speaking of Jacob's love for Benjamin and how losing this son would surely send the old man to his grave. Judah's final words showed a profound change in his character. "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father." This was a stunning contrast to the Judah who, years before, had suggested selling Joseph into slavery. Now, he was willing to become a slave himself to save Benjamin. This act of sacrifice and brotherly love moved Joseph to his core. Joseph could no longer control his emotions. Genesis 45:1-2 tells us, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. With tears streaming down his face, Joseph finally revealed his identity. 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' His brothers were so stunned they couldn't respond. Then Joseph said, 'Come closer to me.' When they had done so, he continued, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you.'" This is one of the most powerful statements in the entire Bible. Joseph held no bitterness for the years he had spent in slavery and unjust imprisonment. Instead, he saw God's hand in everything that had happened. Genesis 45:7-8 records his explanation. "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph explained that 5 more years of famine were still to come and instructed his brothers to bring their father and all their families to Egypt, where he would provide for them. He embraced Benjamin and wept, then embraced all his brothers, and finally, they were able to speak with one another. Overjoyed, Pharaoh heard the news of the arrival of Joseph's brothers and was pleased. He offered them the best land in Egypt and sent wagons to help transport their families and possessions. When the brothers returned to Canaan and told Jacob that Joseph was alive and the governor of all Egypt, the old patriarch at first did not believe them. Genesis 45:26-27 records, "They told him, 'Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt.' Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them, but when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Jacob also called Israel, then resolved to go to Egypt to see his beloved son before he died. On the way at Beersheba, God spoke to him in a vision at night. 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes.' So at the age of 130, Jacob traveled to Egypt with his entire family, 70 people in all. Joseph prepared his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father. Genesis 46:29-30 describes their emotional reunion. Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, 'Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive.' Joseph presented 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh, who confirmed that they could settle in Goshen, the best of the land in Egypt, and even offered employment for those skilled in handling livestock. Joseph also presented his father to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed the Egyptian ruler. As the famine wore on, Joseph wisely managed Egypt's resources. First, the people spent all their money on grain. When their money was gone, Joseph accepted livestock in exchange for food. Finally, when they had nothing left, they sold their land and even themselves as servants to Pharaoh. Through these measures, Joseph acquired nearly all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, except for the land belonging to the priests. He then established a system where the people could farm Pharaoh's land, giving 1/5 of the harvest as tax and keeping the other 4/5 for themselves. This administrative system endured for generations. Jacob's family thrived in Goshen. Genesis 47:27 tells us, "Now the Israelites settled in Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number." After 17 years in Egypt, Jacob felt his end was near. He called for Joseph and made him swear not to bury him in Egypt, but to carry his body back to the land of his ancestors. Joseph promised to do so. Later, hearing his father was ill, Joseph brought his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, for Jacob to bless them. In a moving moment, Jacob crossed his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim, the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh, the firstborn. Joseph tried to correct his father, thinking the old man had mistaken the boys due to his poor eyesight, but Jacob replied, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations." Jacob then adopted both grandsons as his own sons, giving Joseph a double portion of the family inheritance. Next, Jacob called all his sons and gave each a prophetic blessing. To Judah, he foresaw that the scepter would not depart from his tribe until the one to whom it belongs came. To Joseph, he spoke of abundant blessings from the heavens above and the earth beneath. Finally, after blessing all his sons, Jacob died at the age of 147. Joseph threw himself on his father's face, weeping and kissing him. He ordered the physicians to embalm Jacob, a process that took 40 days, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. With Pharaoh's permission, Joseph led a great procession to bury his father in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were also buried. A large retinue of Egyptians accompanied the family to the funeral, showing the great respect they had for Joseph. After Jacob's funeral, Joseph's brothers began to fear that, without their father's presence, Joseph might finally take revenge for the wrong they had done. They sent a message to Joseph claiming that Jacob had requested before he died that he forgive his brother's crime. Genesis 50:17 tells us Joseph's reaction. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Then his brothers came themselves, bowed down before him and said, "We are your slaves." Joseph's response in Genesis 50:19-21 reveals the depth of his character and faith. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph lived to the age of 110, and he saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Before his own death, he said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath that when God came to their aid, they would carry his bones out of Egypt. After his death, he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. It would be over 400 years later, during the Exodus, that Moses would carry Joseph's bones back to the Promised Land, fulfilling this extraordinary man's final request. In Joshua 24:32, we see that promise fulfilled. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. The life of Joseph is an extraordinary journey of dramatic highs and devastating lows. From a beloved son to a slave sold by his own brothers, from a prisoner to a prime minister, his story is a powerful testimony to the sovereignty of God in even the darkest of circumstances. Through every trial, Joseph maintained his integrity and his faith. The young man who had big dreams lived to see them come true in ways he could never have imagined. The boy who wore a coat of many colors would one day wear the fine linen of an Egyptian governor. Even more impressive was his ability to forgive those who had wronged him, recognizing God's hand even in the most painful moments of his life. When he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," Joseph expressed a profound spiritual truth that transcends his own story. Through the life of Joseph, God preserved the family of Israel during a severe famine, allowing them to grow and multiply in Egypt. What began as a family tragedy ended in the salvation of many, setting the stage for the birth of a nation. My friend, if you have followed along this far, the story of Joseph reminds us that even in the most difficult moments of our lives, God has a greater plan. Joseph went from the pit to the prison and from the prison to the palace. He was betrayed, sold, falsely accused, and forgotten, but he never lost his faith or his integrity. And when he finally revealed his identity to his brothers, he said something that should echo in all of our hearts. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. May we hold on to that same trust in God as we face our own trials. If this story has touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Click that like button to help us reach more people with these biblical narratives. Leave a comment sharing which part spoke to you the most, or what other stories you would love to see on our channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming Bible story videos. Share this video with a friend or a loved one who might need a reminder of God's faithfulness in hard times. Sometimes a simple Bible story can bring hope to someone walking through a valley. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of Joseph. May God bless your week, and I will see you in the next video.